Okay, now for the next parts of the Tamiya Tiger I for that 70s build. I've gotten everything as I showed in my last video. I'm up to this point. The interior is completely done, and I am up to step through step 10. So I'll be starting on step 11. Which will entail detailing the front of the tank, start working on the Feifel air cleaners jack, and then start working on the back plate, the rear of the hull. So that's the parts I'm going to start working on, and I'll kind of video some of this as I go. But anyway, let's get started. Okay, it looks like all the parts for step 11 are on sprue C and sprue D, as well as part M4, which is this clever shovel head. I remember that from whenever I built it way back when. It's kind of cool because it actually, this little part right here wraps around the handle of the shovel just like the real deal. So it's kind of clever. Whether or not it's really necessary to be made out of metal, I don't know, but it was, I'm sure it was very novel for back in the day, considering they didn't have photo etch back then. So anyway, most of the parts are on C with a few on D, so I'm going to start clipping these things off and start getting everything cleaned up so I can attach it to the front of the hull. Okay, so far I've got the front of the vehicle done. Everything's installed. I haven't installed the shovel yet, but I won't do that until after I do the painting. But all the small parts have been installed, and now I'm getting ready to work on the back, the rear plate. And one of the first things to work on is the Feifel air cleaner canisters, and I've got one of them glued together. I'm going to cut the other one off here real quick just to make some notations for you. Now, again, remembering this is an old kit, but right here in the middle where the two canisters come together, there's like a weird little, it's almost like a step up part. So like this part and this part are higher than the rest of the surface that's supposed to be cemented together. And then this one has a weird little, two little step up kind of thing. So what that means is whenever I put it together, just gently squeezing, well, actually squeezing it pretty hard in the middle where those step ups are, there's this huge gap around the edges. So I worked on those separate parts a bit, and it just wasn't working. So what I ended up doing, there's locator pins on the one side, you know, that match into the holes here, but it just wasn't working. So what I ended up doing is cutting off the locating pins, and then I carefully lined it up. Here's the one that I've already put together. I carefully lined it up after I sanded it really well on this sanding stick. I just laid it flat and sanded it really smooth so I could get the seam to actually come together. Now it's got a pretty girty looking seam here, and I'm going to start sanding on it and see how well it smooths out. It should be okay. but that without doing that, that would have been impossible to cement together. I mean, it just wouldn't have worked. I mean, I tried clamping it and everything else, and so I just sanded it off. I didn't need the locating pins. I tend, especially when there's like a really long, complicated seam like this, or even like on a fuselage of an airplane, I tend to do it in sections. I'll do one section and either hold it, I use the Tamiya extra thin for stuff like this, so it sets up really quick. So I can hold it for a few seconds, or at least clamp it, and then once it's cured enough that I can let go, I can move on to the next part and just kind of work my way around without having to worry about lining everything up at once and then trying to hold it. So anyway, I got that one together. I'm going to start sanding it down. I'll do the same with this one, and then start cutting out some of the other parts for the back, for the rear hull plate, and go on from there. Okay, I've got the parts all cleaned up for the back hull plate. I've got the Feifel air cleaners cleaned up, and as you can see here, it's not too bad. The seams filled in nice, so once I get it primed, it'll be pretty good. But yeah, these things are really kind of a mess. Not very good seam lines, but hey, it's an old kit, so what can you expect? So anyway, those are done. I've installed the back plate. I've installed the manual starter handle and the adapter plate. The back plate is cemented into place, and so now all I have to do is install all these parts on the back. Now the covers, the exhaust covers, I'm not actually going to install yet. I'll go ahead and paint them when I paint everything, but I want to rust up the exhaust before I install these. So all that'll be installed, but these will be set aside to be painted when I paint the rest of the kit, or the rest of the tank. So I'll get all this stuff installed, and with the exception of these, and that will finish up steps 12 and 13. Alrighty then, I've completed up to step number 13, which is basically finished up the front portion of the hull, which included cementing this whole front piece in place, the spare track holder with a step on it, the clevis hooks, the tow hooks, whatever you want to call them, this grab handle, the bullet splash guard there, and the holders for the shovel in the front. And then in the back, got the back plate installed, the Feifel air cleaners, more tow hooks, the starter manual starting handle, crank starting handle, whatever you want to call it, and adapter plate, and the exhausts, and the back fenders, mud flaps, whatever you want to call them. So those are all installed. That's all ready to go. These were also part of that section. The jack and the exhaust covers, I am not, like I said earlier, I'm not going to install those until after I actually paint. I'll just paint these along with it. That way I can get everything painted and then rust these before I install these, and then I can start weathering the whole vehicle. So that is done. Now the next part that's coming up starts at step 14, and that is the fenders and the wire rope for reinstalling the tracks when they have to be repaired or whatever. So I'll be putting those together, and then it looks like the upper deck. with all the tools and the front hatches, the remainder of the Feifel air cleaner system. And then once steps 14 through 16 are complete, then it looks like we're off to the main gun and the turret interior and then exterior. So coming up next on the next video will be steps 14 through 16. And just, you know, some quick notes on the previous steps. Again, everything's fit together fairly well. You know, I discussed the weird fit of the Feifel air cleaner halves, but I also discussed how I fixed it. But other than that, you know, it's been going together pretty well, especially for a kit that was that the molds were made in 1969. So, you know, it's been fun so far, and I don't expect it'll be anything different as I continue along. So that is the end of this episode of Plastic Models by a Regular Dude, and keep your eyes peeled for the next installment.